Hi, welcome back to Storytime with Ophelia Immune. All I want in life, as I'm having a really hard time coping with human realities and existence and the way that we all treat each other, all I want is story time. So I'm going to give story time, hoping that some other people will do the same. Please give me story time. We all need it to cope with being human. And the story time that I can give away is from my story, Ophelia Immune. The Cell. Swan stood in the pale moonlight and swished her thin hips back and forth, swinging her rag dress about her knees. She held her arms out just so, prancing on her tiptoes and curtsying to me. She hadn't eaten more than one meal a day for the last 3 weeks. How do I look? Like a poor wisp of a girl who is going to get sold at an auction. She threw her hands to her face. Oh, stop! I'm blushing. I walked to her and crouched near her hem, feeling along with my fingertips. Beyond the threads and the slight fold of the fabric, I could make out the narrow outlines of 2 scalpels, stitched into the seams. I looked past her, out the window, my own set of scalpels in my palms. I didn't smile. Why are you always so grouchy? She stuck out her skimpy bottom lip. You're even more stern now that you don't look like a zombie. Or brown, you beanpole, I snapped. The lack of food had made her into a genuine waif. Her jaw chattered in the cool spring breeze. Goose pimples decorated her pale flesh, completely exposed to the nighttime elements, summery and mild as they were. She more than looked the part. The rag dress accentuated the collarbones that I'd heard clattering every time we had launched a practice Molotov cocktail at the charcoal outline of a dirt bag on the roof of our building. Her bony knees jutted out from behind tendons that I had worried would splice every time she had climbed into a rusty, jagged dumpster to find more bottles to make cocktails. I worried that her starved arms were no longer strong enough to swing her fire poker that we had already hidden with our other ambush supplies in the alleyway that was advertised as the site of the next auction. We were prepared. There was very little left to do. I blinked, focused my eyes, and used one of my remaining scalpels to slice open the skin of my forearm in a neat straight line. I tucked the scalpel inside of the slit and pinched the skin back over it, feeling the welcome tingle of the cut and the hum of regenerating skin. When the gash held itself shut, I took the other scalpel and lashed it into my other forearm using the same method. Can I touch them? She asked. Your arms. I draped a thin piece of rag over my new wounds and held them out to her. She ran her fingertips lightly over my covered skin and then pressed harder as she followed the razor handles backwards to my elbow. Her eyes wide and her mouth silent. She brushed a fingerprint across my bare skin. No, never bare skin. I snapped at her again and then was immediately sorry. The abandoned girl's diet had been hard on her. I straightened her rag dress across her shoulders. Help me use this bleach to lighten the new cuts one last time. She bent over my arms with a cotton swab and a pair of gloves, and when she was finished, she stepped back and nodded her approval that I looked white and human. Not healthy, but not dead. I moaned. I twisted my arms around in a couple of wide circles, checking my razor blade placement. Satisfied that they would hold to rotate and lift with use, I disappeared out of her door. I'll be right back. I have one last thing to do. The deadbolts to my apartment creaked. Skin and bone, lipless, sightless, Juliet, too thin even for a living waif, clattered over to me, and the only flowery cotton summer outfit that I could find to make her look less like a centipede. I pet her on the scalp as she drooled on my ankle. There you are. Come over here, my sweet, my little bean. Smiley. I clipped Imogen's favorite plastic alligator barrette into her braids instead of my own orange abominations, and I made sure that it was firmly in place. She followed me into our kitchen and lapped at the bowl of fresh water that I placed on the floor. I wrapped the tether ribbon snugly around her belly 3 times, tying the bow into a double knot. I tickled my fingers under her chin and tilted her face up to mine. Her gray eyeballs roamed restlessly across nothing. Listen, my little cricket, I said. I have to go take care of something, and I might not make it back. I kissed her forehead. She leapt at my face. I think I will make it back. Little sister, I will probably be right back really soon, okay? Even if I don't come back, at least Uncle Donnie won't come looking for you. I love you. I straightened the bow on her cardigan. She grappled with her ribbon tether. It's just like that story I've been reading to you, the one with the little green engine. It's a big, big hill, and I am rather small, but I think I can. You see, I'll probably make it. It will be fine. I love you. She snapped at my wrist. Whoa there! You don't want to get a hold of my arms today, little one. They're sharper than usual. I felt my arms to make sure the razors were still in place and filled a second bowl with fresh water, setting it down next to the first. She stuck her hand in it, then licked her paw frantically. I gave her a 3rd pot full, just in case. There you go. You have a little extra water, you are safely tied up, and I will be back soon. I love you. Good night. See you soon. I love you. I crept back into the hallway, the peeling rosebud wallpaper waving goodbye in the breeze. Swan set one bare foot onto the stairwell expectantly. I followed, forcing my toes to accept the smut of the never-swept hallways and the gritty rubble without dancing back and forth out of disgust or running for my shoes. We had to be barefoot. We had to look abandoned. The alleyway was worse, with puddles of scum and tacky blotches of tar. We avoided all of the largest piles of poisoned rat bodies and sewage that was tossed out of windows, but I still worried for Swan's feet. What if she got a cut and then stepped on something squishy and infected? What if I got her killed even before we tried out our plan? What if Uncle Donnie found us and killed us and we never made it to the auction to ambush the whole thing? Slow down, I urged her. We don't know who is coming around that corner. Nothing is certain, Ophelia. I'm ready. She carried on at her own speed. When I grabbed her arm to hush her as we approached the propane factory, she turned calmly and whispered to me, looking straight into my pupils. It's okay, Ophelia. We're supposed to get caught this time. I'm ready. She placed her hand gently on mine. I winced. Her skin folded over my own. But it was probably okay, because we had just checked that I was all perfectly intact and horribly lighter. She led me into the dirty corner of a dirty street. Men's voices grew near. We hunkered and dug our elbows into our bellies, feigning innocence, but trembling with genuine fear. 2 men saw us and walked directly for us. Sellers, already. Too easy, too easy. They were both wiry and lean. One had a hideous mustache that gaped over a scar on his lip. His companion was missing a tooth and was wearing a mildewed necktie. They were both wearing musty hats. They whistled, and a 3rd man followed behind them, leisurely swinging a cane as he went. Swan and I scooted closer together. I wedged my raggedy shirt between our bare arms. The 3rd man's suit was a nice shirt tucked into his untorn pants. The brain to their brawn. He didn't smell like mold and piss. He didn't look like such a bad man to sell one's daughter to, if one had to sell their baby. Like maybe he could afford to keep them. He looked all around the corner that we were huddled in. He examined the rooftops, slowly scanning the nearby street ends for any of our potentially protective kin. Seeing none, he pointed at us with a clean-trimmed fingertip. All right, we'll take these 2. Silly girls, You should have found someplace else to squat. But that's all right. We'll give you a roof. Swan released her grip on me as one of the men stretched out his meat slabs to grab her. She whimpered lightly as she looked up into the faces of our captors. She studied them intently for a moment and then let her eyes drop to the ground as the hulking figure with a mustache picked her up and carried her away by the elbows. "Why do I always get the bigger one?" whined the carrier with no front tooth. I stood and looked at my feet, very small relative to the bulky buildings and the towering dirt bags. I stopped breathing so that I wouldn't accidentally gurgle. He took me by a fistful of my rags and led me to the makeshift leash, grateful that at least summer had begun so I didn't feel so cold to the touch. I followed him slowly away. The man in the suit smiled as we passed. "Any home sounds good after a corner like that. Smart birds. You might make it yet. Jeff, put those sisters in separate cells. Pierre, don't keep them together." Jeff, with his missing tooth, and Pierre, with his horrible facial hair, lunged at us to mostly burned-out building and pushed us inside the charred doorway. Questionable support beams bulked over our heads. Half of the floor was missing. There was a gaping hole down to the basement, and this is where they forced us. There was a ladder down to the cellar. It was missing several rungs, and after we stumbled down, we could see 4 cells hunkered against the 4 corners of the stone foundation. Pierre tossed Swan into one cell and me into the next. They were already full of girls. There were 8 in my cell. They huddled in a pile in the corner, nearest its barred window to the outside world. 3 of them tried to stand. 2 of them succeeded, and the other fell backwards to the ground, landing against the bare legs of an unflinching smaller girl. 4 of the girls didn't even have rags. They were naked on the dirt floor of the burned-out basement. I gasped and stepped backwards, away from the stench of urine puddles that I could see gathering in the low places on the floor. "Hey, we didn't promise you a mansion, did we, Bird?" The boss in his fancy clothes clicked his heels away from the lip of the first floor. "Go cut the bread," he ordered to Jeff and Pierre. With us all locked safely away, they shuffled to a closet behind one of the other cells. The 2 girls were still standing collapsed onto the ground. They sighed and lay down still, not speaking or blinking, cheeks against the packed earth. I knelt next to them, careful to check for open wounds as I grazed their cheeks with rags draped over my fingers. "Is everybody okay?" I asked, meaning relative to dead, not knowing what else to ask. "You should stand up," the girl who had fallen first told me. "Whenever they look at you, show them that you are strong enough to be sold to their fancy buyers who come in at any old time, not even just for the auctions. If you can't stand when they lift you, you don't even get to the auction. You just die here, because nobody would want to buy you." I shuffled around to the front of the cage to see where Jeff and Pierre might be. They were still missing, and I couldn't hear any footsteps. "Psst!" came a voice from the cell next door. It was Swan. "Swan," I whispered urgently, "don't let them see you standing. If they see you standing, you might get sold before the auction. You have to look weak enough to get sold last, but then strong enough to get to the auction." "I know," she shouted back. "And did you hear that? They're going to get us bread." "Help the other girls eat," I advised, ducking out of sight and joining the pile of girls as Jeff and Pierre came around the corner carrying trays. They banged on the bars with an empty cup. "Soup's on," they hollered. Some girls in each cell crawled to the bars at the front. Many others remained inert, not even glancing at the pans of mush that were set beside the gates. Jeff and Pierre's keys jangled on their belts as they ascended the ladder and disappeared again, leaving us alone. I peered inside of the pans. They were full of bread, soaked in water. A few of the girls dipped their hands into the bottom of the pan, lapped at the water, and then scooted away, crying softly and holding their stomachs. "What are you doing?" I asked, horrified. "You should eat." "It's moldy, all blue," one girl shrieked, gripping her ribs and rocking herself over and over again into a stone that jutted out of the wall. "Shh," another whispered to me. "The auction is tomorrow. If you are strong enough to stand, it's not worth the risk of poisoning from the rotten food." "Oh." I sighed and looked more closely. The girl who could not the girls who could not move retreated back against the walls, puzzled that I pawed at the foul bread. Their atrophied legs were crooked under them, like they had all grown up in cars, despite their city living. I gingerly touched the bread for them. I found as many non-moldy sections as I could, and I walked them over to the motionless girls first. Gently, I pressed the soggy bread against their lips until they opened their mouths and swallowed with their eyes closed. I didn't stop until the bread in the tray was gone, and there was a small mound of blue pulp on the ground near the gate. When all that was left was the crumbly water, I carried it all around to the girls, pouring it in their mouths, saving the last few drops for myself. A girl who hadn't taken any bread at all, even when I held the soft, wet fluff up against her lips for 5 minutes, began retching the water that I had poured into her mouth. It came back out through her nose. Poor thing. I set the empty pan back down by the front gate and crouched near her head. I used my ragged sleeve to dry her face. She coughed and spluttered and then just wheezed, spending all of her energy making her chest rise and fall. I held her hand, waiting for one of our guards to return. I couldn't yell for help without gurgling. She breathed steadily for another few hours while I waited, but when I looked down at her in the first rays of a slow dawn that filtered through the barred windows, her chest wasn't moving. Oh, gods! I leapt to the balls of my feet, leaning over her on my haunches. I tapped her cheeks and looked into her eyes. I grasped her head firmly and turned it lightly from side to side. All with no results. I stroked her hair fringes frantically out of her face. I blew a gentle breeze across her cheeks. I tapped on her chest. I moaned with my own jagged breath. It sounded natural in this setting. Several of the other girls moaned with me and moved as far away from us as they could. I choked on nothing and spluttered as I beat lightly on her fixed breastbone. Oh, gods. I arranged her hands in an orderly fashion and smoothed her ragged smock down over her belly button. There was nothing I could do for her legs. They remained cold and limp like the rest of her. I glanced about for a blanket, thinking I should warm her, but there was nothing further in the cell that I could use. "Okay, we should line our bodies up next to her. Get her warm," I urged the other girls, rattling a little bit in my throat. One of them looked up at me from her spot on the floor. "She's dead. Just let her be." "What?" I stood in the middle of them, trying to catch their eyes. "What?" My lungs thundered. I ran into the bars. I grabbed the cold iron and pressed my face against it. "Help!" I screamed, gurgling and rattling. "Somebody help! This girl is dying! We need to warm her!" I ripped the inside of my throat with my volume and felt black sludge slipping within my neck. "Are you okay?" Swan whispered as loud as she could. "No!" I yelled, slumping my shoulders and letting my hands go limp. "I'm not okay. This is not okay. Nothing is okay." "Geez, haven't you ever seen a dead girl before?" croaked a girl in my cage. "Would you just shut up, please?" "They'll come and remove her in the morning," another one piped up, as helpful as she could be with what looked like a broken arm cradled against her bare collarbones. I sighed and then stopped breathing to avoid a longer rattle. I stared at the body for many minutes. Nobody else moved, so I picked her up by the armpits and dragged her over to the front of the cell. The girls shuffled themselves to retake the prime real estate that had been occupied by her body. I set her carefully by the gate, not letting her touch any of the cold bars or the pile of moldy bread. I folded her hands neatly across her stomach and made her legs roughly parallel. I sat down by myself with my eyes closed. I opened them when I heard someone stirring. The girl who had no shirt was heaving at the dead girl's rags, flopping the stiffening limbs. She finally ripped it from the body, toppled over backwards, and crawled away to put it on, torn as it was. I turned away from the girls and kept my eyes shut tight until mid-morning, when I heard the gate click and the keys jangling. The cell was getting hot with the sun that filtered in between the bars. I cracked my eyes open and remained sitting. As many of the girls got to their feet as could. It was more than last night. 4. The bread was working. They were getting stronger already. Pierre frowned down at the body left by the gate. Who's strong enough to eat all the bread without a tummy ache and drag a body all the way over here? He stared at me suspiciously, sitting sullenly alert, all by myself. Too bad for you, he sneered. We didn't expect any highbrow buyers before the auction. His tongue waggled between his remaining teeth. Don't worry, though. You'll go fast and get us a nice high price. He dragged the dead girl's body over to the ladder by one creaking and cracking arm. He left another pan of moldy bread and water. Some of the girls lapped at it, while Pierre collected 3 more dead bodies from the other cells, 2 from Swan's. One by one, he hoisted them over his shoulder by their hair or toes and lifted them up to Jeff, who grabbed their slack stick doll arms and dragged them out of sight. I was sick to my stomach, but as soon as the heels of the last body were gone, and Pierre with them, I hurried to the pan of bread. I stooped over the pond of stagnant food until I had picked away all of the fuzzy sections. I left another blue slop pile for the dirt bags to retrieve like the dead. The girls took the bread much faster this time. Many held out their hands to receive their portion instead of waiting for me to put it in their mouths. They all drank the water that I tipped up into the end of the pan. Swan! Swan! I hissed, casting the empty tin away from me. She mumbled groggily in return, muttering something to someone in her cell. Swan, stay weak. We were right. As the strongest, I'll get sold fast to be in the front of the caravan. You have to get sold last. Stay in the back, not too weak to get sold, but just the weakest to be included. Yeah, okay, she agreed, and I heard a pan clanking from her cell and the moan of another girl. I gotta go. I turned back to my cellmates and observed their sluggish movements. One girl actually yawned. She was full enough to fall asleep. The rest huddled together in the sunny patches until mid-afternoon. We opened and closed our eyes in sequence, me glancing every so often to make sure I wasn't touching anyone's bare skin. We looked longingly at the girl who fell asleep and was panting as she snored. We closed our eyes again when we had seen too much for too long, or when the flies crept into our eyes. They buzzed annoyingly, but they weren't worth the effort of fanning our hands. I wondered if we looked like the shaggy golden tamarinds in the first yellow glossy magazine that Jim had given me. All scrunched around each other, hardly itching at our flea bites, luxuriating in mud. Maybe other primates muttered, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can, to themselves like I was. But when the dirtbags returned to the cell with their neatly suited boss, he called us birds, not any kind of monkeys or primates, not humans. Okay, birds. It didn't sound as nice as Bean or Turtle from Dad, or Yahoo from Swan. Pay attention. I am leaving you with Jeff and Pierre. They are in charge and they know what to do. If anyone is able to run and tries it, they'll kill you. You are not worth the trouble. Do you understand? Girls were already struggling to get to their feet. I stood up and held the arm of a girl who swayed in time with the footsteps of the boss's shiny shoes heading up the ladder. He took the ladder with him, leaving his men stranded in the pit with us, assumed too weak to fight them. Okay then, Jeff pointed at me. You're clearly strong enough. Take the one you're holding over there and wait in the yes pile. Jeff watched us hobble over and sit down where the ladder had been. He picked up another girl who was standing and thrust her at me. He kicked me in the knee for good measure. A little too strong, you are. I grabbed at my shin and moaned, pretending that it was pain instead of hot flashes of tingling anger. He brought girl after girl to our pile, 7 from my cell, 3 and 4 from the next 2. Swan's cell was last. Swan was lying on the floor as the 2 dirtbags carried the girls who could stand over to our mound of puppets. Her slump face down on the dirt floor was too much for me to look at. I turned my attention to braiding the greasy thin hair of the girl in front of me. Jeff and Pierre lifted Swan to their level and set her down with her legs under her. She kept them limp and wobbled so that every time they started to let go of her, she rushed towards the ground. Finally, they let her fall and she stayed down. I willed her not to truly be too weak. Maybe I had turned her into too much of an urchin to play this role. I hoped that my terrified sweating would rinse the bleach out of my skin more quickly. Was my sweat clear or green and gray? I pinched the pigtails of the girl in front of me harder to keep from running to Swan and forgetting the auction plan. "Enough beauty shop!" Pierre called at me. "You, come here." I stood and feigned a limp where he had kicked me, hobbling to the dirt bags. I bowed my head and let them caress me all over, checking for major physical flaws. I was warm from sitting in the mottled sun of our cell. The dingy cellar light suited me. My burned-out pail kept my skin looking no greener than anyone else's. I had no fresh cuts to ooze black blood, and I had no intention of opening my mouth to let them see my rotten gums. If they did, I prayed it would look like an advanced set of toothaches. Common enough. Jeff flipped my hands over in his own and looked at the soft underbellies of my arms. His face scrunched. He called Pierre over. They frowned together at my arms. I tried to tuck them back down at my sides, my face flushed with all of the warm blood in my body. Pierre wrenched my arms back up to his face. "Well, well, well. What do we have here?" His comrade chuckled and ran his thumb down the not quite disappeared scars where I had hidden my weapons. They weren't completely gone yet. They tingled uncomfortably, just like a real human's permanent scar would. I could feel the scalpels click against my bones. He pushed harder, with both of his thumbs. "The street was that bad," Jeff sneered. "Tried to fillet yourself like a dirty little fish. End it all? Bet you'll be pretty glad to get a roof out of this deal. Stupid ugly bitch. Gets a roof just for being a lousy baby maker." They still thought I was an ugly bitch, even though I wasn't brown or green. They considered palpating other parts of my body. I stood still as ice. "Well, Pierre wondered out loud, is suicidal bad enough of a defect to keep her out of the auction? Maybe we could keep her for ourselves." They had no idea that I was hiding razor blades and planning sabotage. They had no idea that I was undead. They were only deciding if I was good enough to sell or if they could rape me themselves. They felt the glands in my neck. "Nah," Chef shook his head. "She's fine. Old scars are nothing compared to the fleas some of these bitches got." Guffaw. Pierre brayed. "Boss, we're ready for the ladder." They shoved me towards it as it dropped. "You're strong enough to climb. Get up there." I took one last look over my shoulder. Swan was still lying on her face in the dirt. I willed her to get up. They pushed me forward on the top rung, and well-dressed Boss yanked me up by my scalp and bright orange hair. I wiped a tiny drip of black blood from my forehead and smeared it against my rags. They were so dirty that maybe no one would notice. "Make yourself useful." The boss handed me a box of rag dresses. For every girl who was handed up the ladders, naked or only half-dressed, I clothed them in enough rags to make them almost decent. The boss lingered to be sure that I didn't overdress them or hide their best physical attributes. I had tattoos and scars more lengthy and puckered than mine, trying to achieve the perfect balance of too pitiful to run away and grateful for any home, but not yet fully dead on her feet. The boss seemed to be overshooting with his fashion advice and instructed me to make them appear close to death, but then my taste in which girls to buy was hardly experienced. I thought that I looked more worthwhile before my makeover. I whispered the girls no words of comfort, lest my bodily fluids burble and alert a dirtbag to bash my skull. They shivered on the floor until everyone who was judged suitable for sale was upstairs. The boss announced that he was going to go get the van, and his two dirtbags stood by the doors waiting. Swan was still in the cellar. Why wasn't she getting up? If she couldn't make it up to the ground level, I would have to abandon all of these girls that I had just dressed to go and rescue her alone. Is she okay? At the thud of the tailgate, the dirtbags pointed at us to climb into the back. Some of the girls grimaced, hardly standing, much less walking. I took the arm of one and stumbled over to the van with her. Jeff and Pierre picked up the girls who could crawl. The girls who looked like they could be crawling but weren't receive sharp kicks, and move sluggishly forward on their hands and knees without the will to protest. A gigantic man echoed through the broken walls. Those of us who were able to turn around... A gigantic moan echoed through the broken walls. Those of us who were able turned around to see the ladder. A hand poked over the horizon from the basement. A second hand followed it, loudly slapping the old boards and flopping limply. A curly, flaming red head appeared, and then a torso and two spindly legs in a rag dress. Swan slithered herself onto the main floor and let her arms shake as she pushed herself first to her knees and then to her feet. She swayed there. She smiled wanly and collapsed to the floor, lifting only one slight hand as an invitation to pick her up. "She's got nice teeth and she can stand. Bring her along," the boss ordered, tucking a new unwrinkled button-down into his pressed trousers. He got into the driver's seat and slammed the door behind him, cargo all piled in the back. Story time. Why does reading about zombies and horrific human behaviors help me cope with horrific human behaviors? I don't know.